Dwight D Eisenhower, the true story of his life and time during World War II, written by Liam Dale, narrated by Liam Dale. Ask a random sample of people to name the history makers of World War II, and you can pretty much predict their answers. First on the list will be Adolf Hitler, who made history for all the wrong reasons. Then next, it could well be Sir Winston Churchill, with his characteristic V for victory sign and large cigar. Such luminaries as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, fondly known to his men as Monty, General de Gaulle, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt are all likely to be in the top 10, along with Hitler's henchman Herman Goering and the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, as well as Italy's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Whether fighting for good or evil, each of these men had a larger-than-life persona, and although Hitler's ruthlessness as a dictator kept the Nazis in line, the Allies needed to work together by more democratic means. The task of diplomatically leading these undoubtedly great, but not always easy characters when it mattered most, fell to affable American Dwight D Eisenhower, who certainly deserves to be called a history maker of World War II. Eisenhower, although perhaps quieter than his more flamboyant counterparts, combined diplomacy and military know to get the job done, and the fact that he inspired enlisted men, civilians on the home front, five-star generals, the French and the British to all pull together was an incredible achievement. The fact that he then went on after World War II to become the 34th President of the United States of America between 1953 and 1961 only highlights further just how much of a force Eisenhower was to be reckoned with, even when he'd already served his country so well and was past what many would consider to be retirement age. Watching Eisenhower comfortably chatting with his men during some of the darkest hours of World War II, he is without doubt a familiar figure, but his story began more than half a century earlier, on the 14th of October 1890. David Dwight Eisenhower was born to a German-American family in Denison, Grayson County, Texas. They were of Pennsylvania Dutch descent, and shortly after the future President of America was born to David Jacob and Ida Eisenhower, they moved to Abilene in Kansas. Although given the name David Dwight, the third of 7 sons, it seems to have been switched to Dwight David after his time at West Point Military Academy. Ironically, this particular Eisenhower was already known as Ike, a nickname that his mother disliked and had at one time or another been applied to all of her 7 sons. It had stuck from Dwight's school days, when older brother Edgar had been Big Ike to his Little Ike. Despite being pacifists, Eisenhower's parents didn't object to their son's entry to West Point in 1911 because they believed it would provide him with a first-rate education. Also, he was a keen athlete, excelling on the football field, but a knee injury prevented him taking up what might well have been a promising career as a sportsman. Nevertheless, Dwight D. Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915, and Europe had been at war since the previous year. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, was assassinated on the 28th of June 1914, it was the catalyst for a global military conflict that would result in over 40 million casualties, of which half were military and civilian fatalities. The trench warfare fought in the fields of Flanders and in northern France between Germany and the Central Powers against the Allied forces of Britain, France and Russia, has gone down in history as one of the bloodiest and most futile conflicts of all time. However, in the opening exchanges, the Americans, led by President Woodrow Wilson, adopted an isolationist policy, but the position of the USA was challenged in the year that Eisenhower completed his studies at West Point. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British liner the Lusitania, which was carrying 128 American passengers. President Woodrow Wilson secured a German agreement to end attacks on passenger ships, but it didn't last long. When the Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, America declared war on Germany on the 6th of April 1917. The strength in numbers of the American servicemen shipped to Europe boosted the Allied attack, and this remarkable footage was shot during the Meuse-Argonne operations. This proved to be the biggest victory for the American Expeditionary Force just before the armistice of November 1918. It allowed the Allies to advance along the Western Front, and it was instrumental in forcing the surrender of the German army. The American Expeditionary Force, without doubt, helped to bring what has often been called the Great War to a speedy conclusion. But for young Dwight Eisenhower, his military duties at this time were much closer to home in Texas, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Eisenhower spent World War I in the new Tank Corps before progressing to train tank crews, and although he would have certainly followed the progress of his fellow Americans overseas, he did not see active service at the Western Front. Yet it was evident that Dwight Ike Eisenhower had settled on a military career, and when he married Mamie Geneva Dowd in 1916, the young couple had many years of life stationed at various military bases ahead of them. This must have come as quite a shock to Mamie, who was born in Boone, Iowa, before her father had made his fortune and afforded his family a life of luxury. Mamie's mother had advocated that if you didn't learn to cook, no one would ask you to do it, and her daughter had followed her advice. Fortunately, her new first lieutenant husband was a very resourceful fellow who happened to be an excellent cook, and this saw them through their early marriage until Mamie could be persuaded to let Ike teach her the basics of cooking. But there was something delightful about the young Eisenhowers, however Spartan the military quarters they happened to live in. There was always a warm welcome for everyone, and their home was nicknamed Club Eisenhower because wherever Ike was, you could guarantee excellent company and stimulating conversation. When the armistice was called at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month 1918, the First World War, described as the war to end all wars, was finally over. But as the American Expeditionary Force returned home, events in Europe meant that this was unlikely to be the case. Even as Eisenhower forged his peacetime military career through the 1920s, the aftermath of World War I was already having serious repercussions in Germany, which would result in America being called once more to fight in Europe. But for Eisenhower, the experience he gained while this was happening, working under the command of such military giants as General Douglas MacArthur, would prove vital to serve not only the USA, but also the world, when a second global conflict would threaten the liberty he, as an American, held so dear. So what exactly was going on across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe that was destined in a little over 20 years to have such dire consequences? Although the government of Germany surrendered unconditionally, there were many ordinary German soldiers who fiercely opposed this action and even called their politicians the November criminals when they signed the Treaty of Versailles. One of the most vehement of the dissenters was an Austrian-born failed painter by the name of Adolf Hitler, who had volunteered to fight for his adopted nation, Germany. The sanctions the victorious Allies placed on Germany at the Palace of Versailles in 1919 were meant to prevent a conflict on a global scale ever arising again, and included the abolition of military service, the Air Force, the Army, and any form of armament manufacture. Great tracts of valuable industrial land were given away to Germany's neighbours, and the Germans were forced to accept total responsibility for the war, which included paying huge sums of money in reparations. The consequences for the population of Germany were catastrophic, and it was in this climate of discontent that Adolf Hitler was able to rise to power, first politically and then absolutely. It's said that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and when Hitler became Führer as well as Chancellor of the German Reich, it was proved beyond question. Meanwhile, events back in America added further fuel to Adolf Hitler's nationalistic fire. The Wall Street crash of 1929 heralded the Great Depression, not just in the USA, but throughout the world, and many of Eisenhower's military compatriots left the army in search of higher-paid jobs. Eisenhower managed to continue as a soldier in part due to the continuation of an allowance paid to Mamie by her father after the birth of their first child, Dwight Eisenhower, in 1917. Sadly, the little boy died from scarlet fever in 1921, but a second son, John Sheldon David Dowd Eisenhower, was born in 1922. The effects of the Great Depression were far-reaching, especially for the people of Germany already facing terrible poverty because of the war debt, and matters became much worse. When Adolf Hitler promised to restore national pride and drafted the country's many unemployed into military service, it seemed as if he was the answer to Germany's prayers. However, Adolf Hitler was far from being of sound mind, and his pathological persecution of Jews, communists, the disabled, and many ethnic groups was extremely dangerous. His determination to enforce racial hygiene through genocide was not at this stage known to the rest of the world, but Hitler's plan to rebuild the German Empire in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles was already ringing alarm bells across Europe. First, he reclaimed the Rhineland and then forced Austria into unification with Germany. By 1938, Hitler had annexed land belonging to Czechoslovakia, but it was one step too far. The world was again on the brink of global war after this German display of aggression, but the Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, worked tirelessly in a campaign to appease Adolf Hitler, and even flew to Germany to meet the Führer to secure his signature on the Munich Agreement. When Chamberlain returned, he confidently proclaimed to the people of Britain that this meant peace for our time, but nothing could have been further than the truth. Early in 1939, Hitler's National Socialists, better known as the Nazis, marched into Prague and took the remainder of Czechoslovakia. Despite the hopes of Neville Chamberlain, nothing was going to stop Adolf Hitler, and when the Nazis stormed into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, after signing a non-aggression pact with Russia, a Second World War was inevitable. On Sunday, the 3rd of September, Neville Chamberlain spoke to the people of Britain directly through a radio broadcast on the BBC. At 11:15 a.m., as Adolf Hitler had failed to respond to an ultimatum demanding the removal of his troops from Polish soil, Prime Minister Chamberlain announced that Great Britain was at war with Germany. Within hours of war being declared, it looked as if history might be repeating itself for the Americans. The USA had, at this point, declared its neutrality, but when the British liner, the SS Athenia, travelling between the United Kingdom and Canada on the 3rd of September, was sunk by a German U-boat, Hitler had something of a dilemma. The Athenia was carrying more than 300 American passengers, and of the 112 killed, 28 were from America. The Nazi propaganda machine went straight into action, claiming it was a British submarine under the orders of Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, responsible for the attack. At this early stage in the war, although neutral, the Americans had a very close relationship with Britain, and Hitler didn't want the sinking of this ship to be a repeat of what happened with the Lusitania in 1915. In effect, bringing the full might of the Americans into the war. The moment passed, but the Americans didn't give any credence to German protestations that Winston Churchill was to blame, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt continued to send essential supplies to Britain. The first few months of World War II have often been described as the phony war, as the major combatants secured alliances and built up their armaments. But in the early months of 1940, Adolf Hitler began his Blitzkrieg campaign. The Nazis occupied Norway and Denmark, and then set their sights on the Low Countries and France. The British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had been dispatched to the Franco-Belgian border at the outbreak of war. And as the Nazis stormed through Holland and Belgium, a huge number of the Allies' fighting men were in danger of becoming trapped. At last, Britain was waking up to the real threat that Adolf Hitler posed, and the population no longer had any confidence in Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. On the 10th of May 1940, the man who had worked so hard for a negotiated peace was succeeded by Winston Churchill at number 10 Downing Street, and Hitler immediately had a fight on his hands. The first task faced by Churchill was to rescue the BEF and other Allied forces from the beaches of Dunkirk in northern France, where they were stranded and at the mercy of the Germans. Right from the outset, Churchill had adopted a policy of no surrender, and when he asked for a miracle at Dunkirk, he got one. Civilians who owned all manner of small craft joined together with the Royal Navy to embark upon a rescue mission to bring back more than 300,000 fighting men, instead of the 45,000 that had been anticipated. Despite the elation of Dunkirk, in the cold light of day, the truth was that almost every Allied vehicle and piece of ordnance had been abandoned on the roads of northern France. The Nazis marched into Paris on the 13th of June, and Hitler turned his avaricious gaze towards Great Britain. Winston Churchill may have got his miracle, but he would need many more if Britain was going to stand firm against Hitler's invasion force. However, although America remained on the sidelines, there was a warm relationship between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and America supplied military equipment and armaments, later adopting a Lend-Lease policy that made it possible for the British to stay in the fight. Up until Dunkirk, Hitler had achieved his every objective, and he assumed the invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sealion, would be a foregone conclusion. But he'd failed to take into the account the spirit of the British and the sheer determination of the RAF. In the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, it was a spirit that Hitler just couldn't break, and in 1941 he put his invasion plans on hold and turned his attention to the Russian front, breaking his non-aggression pact with Stalin. As Britain struggled on, seemingly alone, with her European allies under German occupation, Hitler had the support of the Italians and the Japanese with his Axis powers. The turn of events, which led to Hitler's attack on Russia, made the Japanese more aggressively confident in the Pacific while waging a trade war with the Americans. However, the next action taken by the Japanese had a direct result on Hitler when they decided to attack the American Navy at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. The people of America were in a state of shock and completely supported President Roosevelt's decision to declare war on Japan the very next day. By virtue of the pact between the Axis powers, Germany and Italy then declared war on America, and the scene was set for a dramatic showdown that would decide the outcome of World War II. Suddenly, Winston Churchill and the British people were no longer isolated on their island, and by January 1942, American GIs arrived in Britain, and things slowly started to go the Allies' way. In North Africa, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery made inroads into the German occupation, while the Russians held off the Nazi invaders on the Eastern Front, and by 1943 they had defeated the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Also, Mussolini's days in Italy were numbered, as he was overthrown by his own people after the British and the Americans had invaded Sicily, overseen by none other than Dwight D Eisenhower. Now, while this was all being played out around the world, Eisenhower had earned himself a first-class reputation for his administrative abilities. After returning from the Philippines, where he served with MacArthur in 1939 as a lieutenant colonel, Eisenhower held various staff appointments in Washington, D.C., California, and Texas. A further promotion came in September 1941 to Brigadier General, and after Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower was attached to the General Staff in Washington. While in Washington, Eisenhower became Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of the Operations Division under General George C. Marshall. It was Marshall who recognized his subordinates' exceptional organizational and administrative abilities and recommended Eisenhower for senior command positions. The first of these was Commanding General, European Theatre of Operations, which took Eisenhower to London in 1942. Added to this, he was then also appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in North Africa. The pace of the war for the Allies was gaining momentum, and in February 1943, Eisenhower's mandate was extended to include the British Eighth Army, commanded by the then General Bernard Montgomery. Monty, as he was fondly known to his men, was a unique character, and without doubt a World War II history maker in his own right. For Eisenhower, this would prove to be a very tough challenge indeed, as Montgomery was as headstrong as he was brilliant, and was already no stranger to controversy. In fact, after the escape from Dunkirk, he was so critical of the War Office and their handling of the BEF, he was actually relegated to divisional command for a short while. But he soon got his chance to get back to the heart of the action. When Monty took command of the Eighth Army in North Africa, he immediately raised the morale of the fighting men, visiting the different units in person as often as possible, getting to know his soldiers, and more importantly, giving them the opportunity to get to know him. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had ordered a quick campaign against Rommel and the German army in North Africa, but Monty fought the battle his way, slowly and meticulously, refusing to endanger his men when there was little to be gained. As a result, Montgomery was respected by his men, who were devoted to him, while his superiors at the War Office were often the last to discover what was going on. It's been said that Montgomery was great to serve under, difficult to serve alongside, but hell to serve over, something that Eisenhower would soon discover. When Montgomery was finally ready, the Battle of El Alamein began on the 23rd of October 1942 and was over 12 days later, just as Monty had predicted. It was one of the most important and decisive land battles won by the Allies, and it proved to be a real turning point in the war. Back in Britain, Monty was a national hero and promoted to the rank of general before receiving a knighthood from King George VI at Buckingham Palace. As the North African campaign continued, Montgomery's style of leadership produced great results, and Rommel was certainly kept in check. Quite naturally, when the Allies were able to progress from North Africa to Europe in Operation Husky, the joint British and American invasion of Sicily. Mentioned a little earlier, Montgomery and the Eighth Army were at the forefront of the attack. It was here that the tensions between Montgomery and the American generals Patton and Bradley began, which would require all Eisenhower's tact and diplomacy to keep under control. In what was to come, General Omar Bradley, a polite and courteous man, found himself in direct conflict with Montgomery's strategies for Europe. Add to this the controversy that often surrounded General George Patton, and you begin to perceive exactly what Eisenhower had to contend with. Patton was nicknamed Old Blood and Guts, and bloodthirsty motivational speeches were far more his style than General Bradley's gentler methods. In fact, in 1943, it was Eisenhower's advice that may well have been instrumental in saving Patton's career. While visiting injured American soldiers in hospital to commend the wounded, Patton slapped two young privates and accused them of being cowards, as they bore no visible wounds. Both men were suffering from shell shock, what we would today term as post-traumatic stress disorder, and when news of the incident was made public, many believed that Patton should resign or face dismissal. However, Eisenhower advised Patton to publicly apologize to the injured soldiers and all at the hospital who had witnessed the event. It was not an order, but Patton apologized and was temporarily relieved of duty. Ironically, General Patton would prove to be very useful to the Allies in the liberation of Europe, which was now fast becoming a reality rather than a longed-for dream. As 1943 ended, an announcement was made naming Eisenhower Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and in January 1944 he was also charged with the task of being the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. The race for victory against the Nazi domination of Adolf Hitler was on, and thankfully for the free world, Dwight D Eisenhower was the right man for the job. Plans for the liberation of Europe began almost as soon as the Americans entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and when Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Russian leader Joseph Stalin met in 1943 in the Iranian capital Tehran, Operation Overlord was decided upon. For Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, the inevitability of an Allied invasion coming sometime in 1944 was far from being a great military secret. But if it were to be successful, Eisenhower and the Allies would need the element of surprise on their side, and as Operation Overlord was set in motion, the Allied intelligence services went into overdrive. The first requirement was the gathering together of an Allied invasion force and all the equipment they would require in the south of England, transforming the coast into a huge embarkation point. Americans, Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders arrived to join British troops ready to cross the English Channel whenever the command was given. It's interesting to note that just as the commanders of the Allied forces had all manner of issues with each other, so did the soldiers fighting on the ground. Eisenhower had to balance the egos of charismatic leaders and single-minded generals in all directions before he could even start to fight a war with Adolf Hitler, while there was a common expression amongst the British for the influx of American GIs. The American servicemen were a glamorous addition to the social scene, often bearing gifts of nylon stockings and chocolates for the nation's ladies. Described as overpaid, oversexed, and over here by the disgruntled British servicemen who struggled to compete, Eisenhower had a demanding job ahead because he needed to unite the Allied forces at every level. Nevertheless, the American GIs soon developed a witty answer for their British counterparts, calling them underpaid, undersexed, and under Monty, the commander the American generals took the greatest issue with. As 1944 progressed and the Allies pushed their way into Italy, the British counterintelligence service set about convincing the Germans that the imminent attack would come between the Kent coast and Calais at the narrowest point across the English Channel. Operation Overlord would actually take a much longer crossing further west between the south coast of England and Normandy in France. Consequently, whenever a reconnaissance flight passed over Normandy, two were sent to the Pas de Calais, focusing the Germans' attention miles away from the French ports of Caen and Cherbourg at either end of the proposed landing beaches. There was a major intelligence scare just before the Normandy landings that has never been fully explained, which caused the British Secret Service to question whether German spies had compromised the operation. Overlord was the code word for the whole invasion, and the actual beaches where the landings were to take place had the code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Naturally, when the words Utah and Omaha appeared together in a Daily Telegraph crossword, British intelligence became rather suspicious. When they were later followed by the words Overlord and Mulberry, the code name for the artificial harbours the Allies intended to use in France, things didn't look good. Nobody was more surprised than the English teacher who had set the offending crossword clues when MI5 turned up on his doorstep. The whole bizarre incident was put down to coincidence, but Eisenhower must have been left wondering just how much the Germans knew when the time came for him to give the order for D-Day to begin. By the first days of June, everything was in place for the Allied invasion of France, and when the Allies took Rome on the 4th of June, it was a good omen for the planned attack on the Germans in France the very next day. Now, just as Montgomery had gained experience in North Africa that would help him play his part in the liberation of France, the man he had defeated at El Alamein, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had also learned some valuable lessons. It was Rommel who Hitler had entrusted with the task of resisting any Allied invasion, and was not a man who should ever be underestimated. However, the fates were definitely set against Rommel early in June 1944. The art of weather forecasting is to this day a precarious business, and in 1944 the June weather was particularly unseasonable. There were storms and gales that would have been more commonly associated with the depths of winter, and as the wind and rain lashed the south coast of England, Eisenhower must have wondered how on earth the Allied invasion force would ever get to France. Yet the weather proved to be anything but a disadvantage for the Allies. Rommel looked at the appalling forecast for the first week of June and decided that only a madman would order an invasion in such terrible conditions. As to date, Eisenhower, who would give the ultimate order to go, had shown no sign of any such mental deficiency. Rommel decided it was perfectly safe for him to return to Germany for his wife's birthday party. The Germans were so convinced that the Allies were not ready to attack their chief of intelligence, dismissed a tip-off regarding a BBC broadcast. Throughout the years of the German occupation, the French resistance had worked tirelessly to undermine their oppressors and would have an important role to play when the invasion began. When the coded message was broadcast on the 1st and 5th of June saying, "The long sobs of the violins of autumn and wound my heart with a monotonous languor," it was telling the resistance that the Allies were on their way. Even though the Germans knew that this was the signal, they refused to believe that the invasion would come in such terrible weather, and they certainly didn't think such an important communication would be trusted to the airwaves. Fortunately, the French resistance had far more confidence in their allies and were ready and waiting to play their part in the defeat of Germany and the destruction of Adolf Hitler. So, the 5th of June dawned, and the weather was atrocious. Eisenhower had so many issues to consider, but the final decision lay solely with him, and he chose to postpone the invasion until the next day. But the 6th of June saw little improvement in the storms out at sea, and the pressure was really on. If Operation Overlord did not go ahead on the 6th of June, it would be at least a fortnight before another attempt could be made because of the state of the tides. With thousands of troops already aboard ship, the prospect of keeping the entire operation secret for 2 whole weeks was just about impossible. And Eisenhower proved to the world that his appointment as Supreme Allied Commander had been justified, bravely giving the go-ahead for Operation Overlord to commence. To really understand the abilities of Eisenhower in command, we only have to look at the different elements of D-Day, as the 6th of June became known, to see how truly skilled he was. When people think of D-Day, it is understandably the dramatic scenes of soldiers emerging from landing craft to face the enemy fire that first comes to mind. However, the role of the RAF and the American Air Force was equally as important, and they saw action first as they prepared the way for the landings. The American Air Force took to the skies over the Cherbourg end of the Normandy coastline, dropping paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions into the battle zone. Sadly, many were drowned because of Rommel's strategy to flood any ground suitable for parachutists to land on, and many others were dropped miles off course. The most famous of these American paratroopers was Private John Steele, and if you travel today to the delightful little French town of Saint-Marie-Église, you'll see why. On the church spire hangs a replica of Private Steele, caught by his parachute, and this is precisely what happened just before D-Day. Private Steele dangled there for hours, pretending to be dead, but to no avail, as he was captured by the Germans. However, at the Caen end of the coast, the British 6th Airborne Division fared rather better. Their task was to take a strategically important bridge, and using silent Horsa gliders, they landed on target and accomplished their mission with ease, thanks to the element of surprise. It was the first victory of the campaign for Normandy, and since that night, this has been known as Pegasus Bridge, in honour of the flying horse insignia of the British Airborne Division that liberated it. When the bridge was replaced in 1994, many veterans objected, but the modern version does look very similar to the one Major John Howard and his men encountered 50 years earlier. For the people of France, this was a night of great celebration, and the Gondry family, who owned the cafe next to Pegasus Bridge, dug up the 19 bottles of champagne that had been hidden in the garden throughout the German occupation to toast their liberators in style. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill described the D-Day landings as the beginning of the end of World War II, and in the early hours of June the 6th, 1944, the Allies had a great deal more to achieve if they were going to build on the success of Pegasus Bridge. The Normandy beaches were divided up, and Eisenhower had allocated the forces to fight on each one. The Americans started the proceedings on the beaches of Utah and Omaha, closest to Cherbourg, but the stories of what happened to the respective landing parties couldn't have been more different. At Utah Beach, 30,000 American troops came ashore with the dawn, along with 3,500 vehicles. Preparations had been thorough from the air, and shell fire from strategic battleships meant that there was little resistance to the American onslaught. A navigational error brought the troops ashore a mile south of the target area, but the beach was quickly taken, with only 197 Allied casualties and the loss of only 4 precious tanks. By contrast, further along the coast at Omaha, it became a battle for survival. On D-Day, the casualties were horrendous, 5,114 dead, missing or wounded. This account, prepared by the U.S. War Department's Historical Division, eloquently sums up what happened here as the morning of D-Day dawned. Within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, a company had become inert, leaderless, and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. It had become a struggle for survival and rescue. Above this beach today, you'll find the beautiful American National Cemetery and Memorial where so many of the fallen lay buried. It's impossible to come here without appreciating the enormity of the task Eisenhower had been charged with, and what it cost an entire generation for it to be realized. Moving along the coast, the British came ashore at Gaulle, while the Canadian 3rd Division led the assault on Juno. Sword, the final landing beach, was heavily mined, and there was considerable overcrowding as the men struggled ashore. There was no guarantee that Overlord would succeed, and Eisenhower took his responsibilities very seriously indeed. Long after the event, a speech was found, written by Eisenhower for broadcast should the invasion fail. He said that the troops, whether Army, Navy, or Air Force, were not to blame. The fault, if there were any, lay totally with him. However, fortunately for Eisenhower, the Allies, and the entire world, D-Day was a success. He then dealt skillfully with his generals to break out from the beaches to liberate France and advance on Hitler and Germany. For the Allied soldiers under General Montgomery, the fight to secure Caen and the eventual breakout did not go to plan and was longer and tougher than had been anticipated. General Patton, in charge of the U.S. Third Army, advanced into Brittany, freeing much of northern France, but bypassing Paris, which was liberated by the French 2nd Armored Division and the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. General Bradley, meanwhile, was covering a wide area from the Netherlands to Lorraine, and eventually took the lead in what was to become the Battle of the Bulge. Appreciating the personalities involved and the vast numbers of American troops, it was no longer possible for the ground forces commander to be British, as had been anticipated after the Normandy landings, and Eisenhower took on the role himself. General Montgomery was understandably disappointed, but Churchill stepped in to promote him to the rank of Field Marshal by way of compensation, and Eisenhower steadily pulled together all the elements to unite the Allies and push into Germany for the final onslaught. When the time came for the advance on Berlin, Eisenhower was faced with one last dilemma. From the east, the Russians were advancing at speed, while the Americans were matching them pace for pace. In the end, Eisenhower agreed to the Russians getting to Berlin first, which there was some criticism of, but the Supreme Commander was aware that it was likely to cost more than 100,000 American casualties. The Russians suffered 360,000 casualties in the final battle for Berlin. The war in Europe effectively came to an end when Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on the 30th of April 1945, followed by the unconditional German surrender on the 7th of May. Eisenhower had delivered everything that had been asked of him, but for his fellow countrymen, there was still a war to be won in the Pacific. Sadly, Franklin D. Roosevelt died in April 1945 before seeing the end of the conflict, and his successor, President Harry S. Truman, was left to conclude matters. In August 1945, he made the difficult decision to drop 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which brought about the Japanese surrender. When Eisenhower returned to America, he served as the Chief of Staff to the U.S. Army until 1948. In 1950, he became the Supreme Commander of NATO, with operational responsibility for NATO forces in Europe. When he retired from active service in May 1952, Eisenhower would have been perfectly entitled to take a well-earned rest, but in 1953 he was elected President of the United States of America, serving his country in the highest office in the land until 1961. Eisenhower retired to the peaceful countryside of Pennsylvania when America, like the rest of the world, was ready for a new post-war era, beginning with the youthful President John F. Kennedy moving into the White House to succeed him. When Eisenhower died on the 28th of March 1969, America lost one of its greatest heroes, as had the rest of the world. The legacy he left behind may not have been as high profile as many of his wartime colleagues, but his military memoir, Crusade in Europe, has gone down in history as one of the finest first-hand accounts of the conflict. However, the biggest tribute to this likable man, who really did know how to get others to become the best that they could be, is to watch Eisenhower in action. Whether chatting comfortably with the soldiers, sailors and airmen who went into battle on his command, or convincing the politicians and generals to follow him, Dwight D. Eisenhower gave his all for freedom and democracy, and the world, to this very day, is still a safer place because of this great military strategist who truly believed that peace and justice were simply 2 sides of the same coin.